I wasn't invited to dinner because it was my birthday, or because anyone missed me, or even remembered what I did for a living. I was invited because my younger brother Andrew got engaged to a woman from a respectable family with moneyed roots and polished vowels. And now the two families had to meet, not because I mattered, but because I wouldn't make things complicated. When I walked into that dining room, all dark walnut wood, glass chandeliers, and long-stemmed wine glasses, I heard the bride's mother laugh from across the room. Vanessa, oh, the one who helps the lawyers file papers. That's adorable. She looks quiet. I smiled. Of course I smiled. After all, what's more dangerous than a woman who's been underestimated her entire life? My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 33 years old. And I'm a federal prosecutor based in Washington, D.C. I've indicted men who run hedge funds and wear $6,000 suits. I've signed off on raids that made front-page headlines. I've stood in courtrooms where the walls were lined with power, and still spoke louder than all of them. But at family dinners, I'm just Andrew's sister. The nice one, the quiet one, the one they assume never made it. Andrew's fiancé comes from a family that loves surface-level sparkle, destination weddings, imported florals, prenuptial contracts framed like certificates. Tonight, they were hosting what they called an intimate dinner between families, which in reality meant they talk, we nod, they brag, we listen, and me, I sit at the far end of the table, with a full glass of wine, and a story I'm used to keeping to myself, because no one asks, because no one ever really wants to know. They don't know that the company they just invested in, the one they spent the past 10 minutes praising, is part of an active federal investigation. And next week, I'm signing the warrant that will bring their boardroom into mine. But tonight, I stay silent, just the way they prefer. The appetizers hadn't even made it around the table before the first blow landed. Soft, sweet, and precisely aimed. "Vanessa, dear," said Ellen, Andrew's future mother-in-law, "do you enjoy working behind the scenes? Must be so nice not to take your work home with you." I looked up from my plate, smiled, tilted my head. Before I could speak, someone else chimed in. "It's important work," said her husband, Gerald. "Courthouses need good support staff. The system would fall apart without them." Their daughter, Madeline, Andrew's fiancée, leaned in, eyes bright. "She's being modest. She told me she works with the legal department. Like, organizing things. She's super organized." Super organized, that's who I was now. A woman who alphabetizes the chaos of other people's decisions. Across the table, Andrew shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't corrected them. Not once. Of course he hadn't. For him, I'd always been the dependable big sister. The one who drove him to practice, helped him fix his resume, covered for him when he missed our parents' anniversary dinner. The idea that I might have built something of my own. Not convenient, not on brand. The room sparkled with chandeliers and Chardonnay. Stories bounced from one side of the table to the other. Deals closed, weddings planned, renovations underway. Madeline talked about her startup marketing agency, like it was a Fortune 500 firm. Her brother bragged about his latest real estate flip in the Hamptons. Their cousin name-dropped senators, and me, no one asked, which was a relief, in a way, because I was tired of folding my title into something less threatening, tired of softening my edges just so someone else could feel taller. Gerald glanced at me again, swirling his wine. "Vanessa, do you enjoy your work, or is it more of a stepping stone, you think?" My lips parted, not to answer, but to decide whether I should answer at all, because behind his smile was something sharper, the kind of smile that tests you, assumes things about you, dares you to disappoint his assumptions. I smiled back. "It's fulfilling. I'm exactly where I need to be." He nodded politely. Didn't ask what that meant, didn't really want to know. The waitress brought out the main course. Sea bass with lemon beurre blanc, mashed potatoes piped into delicate swirls, but the real dish on the table was narrative, and in theirs, I was the side note, the extra, the woman who helped others look important, but never made the spotlight her own. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the morning in a sealed conference room with agents from the Financial Crimes Division, that I'd reviewed offshore accounts tied to a shell corporation. A shell corporation connected directly to Gerald's company, that the man complimenting my quiet support was, as of 3 days ago, a person of interest. And that I, the quiet one, the helpful one, the organized one, was the lead prosecutor on the case. It happened somewhere between the Pinot and the Panna Cotta, a subtle shift, a flicker of hesitation that fractured the room's polished confidence. Gerald's younger brother, Raymond, was scrolling through his phone, not rudely, just bored. He was half listening to Madeline describe her wedding planner's design philosophy. When he froze, not dramatically, not enough for anyone but me to notice, but I did. He squinted at the screen, tilted his head, then looked across the table. At me, twice. He cleared his throat softly, then leaned toward Gerald and whispered something. Gerald leaned in to read the phone, and then, just for a second, his expression cracked. Not confusion, not disbelief, just recalculation. The kind of look a man wears when he realizes the board game isn't going the way he thought. When the quiet player is the one who built the trap. Across from him, Madeline was still talking. Something about signature cocktails and imported napkins. No one was listening anymore. Andrew was laughing too hard at a joke his fiancée's cousin made. He didn't notice his future father-in-law gripping the stem of his wine glass. Like it might shatter, Gerald spoke finally, keeping his voice even. Vanessa Cole, is it? That's right. Vanessa Cole, from the Eastern District Court. I set my fork down, just gently enough, but it echoed. Correct. His voice was careful now, measured. Would that happen to be the same Vanessa Cole who filed a motion last month against Norhaven Holdings? The room went still. Madeline blinked. Andrew looked up mid-chew. What's Norhaven? He asked, smiling like this was some fun trivia night. Gerald didn't laugh. It's a private investment firm, he said flatly. One I sit on the board of. Now everyone looked at me. Even the servers paused, sensing the drop in temperature. I met Gerald's gaze calmly. Yes, that Vanessa Cole. His jaw clenched. Raymond looked down. Madeline's smile faltered. Is there some mistake? She asked. I leaned back slightly, voice even polite. No mistake. I thought you worked at the courthouse, she whispered. Like assisted. I do work at the courthouse, as a federal prosecutor. My team is overseeing the Norhaven case. And just like that, everything changed. No shouting, no grand reveal, just a gentle rearrangement of the room's center of gravity. I was no longer the one they overlooked. I was the one they missed entirely. The room wasn't laughing anymore. They were remembering every dismissive comment they'd made, every assumption, and now every word tasted like cold metal. Andrew stared at me like I'd grown wings, or horns, maybe both. Gerald took a long sip of wine. His hands were trembling just enough to make the glass hum against his ring. Why didn't you say anything earlier? He asked. I smiled, not unkindly. Because no one asked. Madeline's fork hovered midair, caught between confusion and disbelief. Wait, you knew about Norhaven. Her voice had gone softer now, less polished, less performative. You knew and still came tonight. I met her eyes. There was no malice in mine, just truth. I came because I was invited, and because I love my brother. I glanced at Andrew. His jaw was tight. His eyes darted between me and Gerald, trying to catch up. Vanessa, he said finally, why didn't you ever tell me what you really do? The table held its breath. Because every time I tried, you changed the subject, told me to relax, to stop talking about work. You liked me quiet. You all did. Ellen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, folding her napkin like it was something to control. Gerald was still processing, but his silence spoke volumes. The man who once complimented my ability to support the system had just realized I was holding the scalpel. How long have you been? Madeline started. But her voice cracked on the question. Long enough, I said. Long enough to see how quickly people define you. By the version of you that makes them feel better about themselves. Raymond stood, muttering something about needing air. A cousin faked a bathroom break. Even the chandelier light felt colder now, as if the room itself understood that a performance had ended, and a reckoning had begun. Andrew looked wounded, but it wasn't really about me. He was mourning a version of himself. The brother who thought he was always the high achiever. The one who never had to look twice at his sister. "Vanessa," he said again, this time quieter. "Did you think I wouldn't be proud of you?" "No," I replied. "I thought you wouldn't notice." And I was right. Madeline stood suddenly. "So what, you came here to expose us, to humiliate us?" I stayed seated. "I came here to eat dinner." Her eyes narrowed. "You could have said something privately." "Why?" "You had no problem saying things publicly. Calling me an assistant, telling your friends I do low-level legal support." She flushed deep red, and for a moment she looked like a child caught mid-lie. "This was supposed to be a celebration," she whispered. "Then maybe you should have celebrated without cutting others down." The silence was different now. Not awkward, reverent, like a curtain had dropped, and no one knew how to applaud. Andrew stood slowly. "Vanessa," he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." I nodded. "That's the thing, you never asked." And with that I stood, folded my napkin, pushed in my chair. "Thank you for dinner." And I left, not angry, not triumphant. Just free. The next morning I woke up to a string of missed calls. 3 from Andrew, 2 from a number I didn't recognize. One voicemail from Ellen that began with "We need to talk" and ended in a long sigh. I didn't return any of them, not because I was angry, but because I'd spent years shrinking myself, so they wouldn't have to feel small. And last night, for once, I didn't. By noon, I demade coffee, opened the windows, and started reviewing a witness statement. Work was grounding. It didn't ask me to explain myself. Then, a knock, not rushed, not angry, just persistent. I opened the door and found Andrew. Suit slightly wrinkled, hair a little disheveled, eyes full of things he didn't yet know how to say. "I figured you'd ignore my calls," he said. "Not ignoring," I replied. "Just filtering." He half smiled, then held up a bag of croissants from the cafe near our old apartment. A peace offering, or nostalgia, maybe both. We sat in silence for a while. The kind you only get with people who have known each other long enough to skip the small talk. "You blindsided us," he said eventually. Not accusatory, just honest. "No," I said, "you just didn't look." He nodded slowly. "I deserved that." Pause. "But Vanessa, why did you let me believe you were less?" I sipped my coffee before answering. Because it was easier than constantly correcting people. Easier than proving I was worth listening to. "But I would have listened," he said quietly. "Maybe, but you didn't. And somewhere along the way, I stopped needing you too." He looked down, fidgeted with the lid of his cup. "Madeline's upset," he said finally. I waited. "But not just at you, at herself." I raised an eyebrow. She's been living in a world where her success only counts if it shines brighter than someone else's. And last night, she saw what that looked like on the outside. Another silence. Then, "She's not proud of how she treated you. She wants to talk." Not explain, just understand. I nodded. "That's new." "Yeah, for her, and maybe for me too." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You know what scared me most last night?" I shook my head, realizing I never once asked you what you wanted. Not as a kid, not as an adult, I just assumed you'd always be there. I said softly, "until I was." He left without asking for anything more. And that was the first real apology I'd ever gotten from him. Not words, but recognition. She came 3 days later. No warning. No flowers. No curated apology dressed in soft colors. Just Madeline, hair in a loose knot. No eyeliner. Shoes muddy from rain. She stood at my doorway like someone who'd already lost something, but didn't quite know what yet. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. We sat in my living room. No champagne this time. No chandeliers overhead. Just the sound of the rain tapping on the window. She held the mug I offered with both hands, like it grounded her somehow. "I'm not here to explain," she said. "I think that's what I used to do, talk fast, stay in control, look composed." She looked up. "I wasn't composed the other night, I was exposed, and I didn't like who I saw." I didn't interrupt, didn't rescue her with politeness, didn't fill the silence. She took a breath, not a dramatic one, just the kind you take before you say something that might shift the air forever. I didn't know how to be proud of myself without diminishing someone else. I grew up thinking achievement was a spotlight, and there was only room for one. I studied her face, not for weakness, for honesty. You weren't just quiet, she said. You were invisible, because I made you that way. Because it was easier to pretend I was the successful one if no one looked too closely at you. I didn't nod, didn't forgive, not yet. But I didn't flinch either. I don't want to be that person anymore, she said, and then, softer, but I don't know how to be someone else yet. That was the first true thing she'd said to me, maybe ever. I stood and walked to my bookshelf, pulled down a small black frame. Inside was a photo, me in my robe, hand raised, swearing in. I handed it to her. "This is who I am," I said. "You don't have to clap, just don't look away this time." She held the frame gently, eyes glossy but no tears. "I won't," she whispered, and I believed her, not because she said it like a promise, but because, for once, she didn't say it like a performance. We didn't suddenly become close. There were no Sunday brunches or matching Christmas pajamas. No late-night calls swapping childhood stories or wedding plans, but we talked, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, and sometimes with ease. Madeline sent me an article one morning, something about a new financial regulation case I was working on. No caption, just the link. It wasn't much. But it was the first time she looked at my world and didn't look away. At Andrew's engagement photo shoot, yes, they stayed together. She introduced me to the photographer as Vanessa, my sister-in-law. She's a federal prosecutor. And just like that, the air shifted. No self-deprecating smile. No qualifying joke. No, she helps out at the courthouse. Just truth, plain, undefended. My parents called more often, asked real questions, didn't always understand the answers, but stayed long enough to hear them. My mother sent me a copy of a magazine clipping, my name quoted in a legal piece. She decircled it, wrote, "I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." That page is still in my drawer. Andrew hugged me the night of his wedding. Not the quick, brotherly pat kind, but the kind that says, "I see you, I'm sorry I didn't sooner." And that was enough. Not everything was repaired. Some people stayed distant, some relationships stayed surface. But that's okay, because I didn't need their approval anymore. I never did. I just needed space to stand fully in my own story without shrinking it, to fit someone else's comfort. And now, I don't wait for people to ask. I don't apologize when I answer. I don't play small so someone else can feel tall. Because the moment I stopped dimming my light, I realized it was never me they were afraid of. It was their own reflection. In the light, I refused to hide. Have you ever had to shrink yourself just to protect someone else's ego? Have you ever been made small in a room you helped build? If this story felt like yours, leave a comment that says, "I see myself," because you're not alone, and you deserve to be seen.